Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of the Export Impact Podcast, brought to you by Export Development Canada. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting to you from EDC's head office in Ottawa, which is the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We value taking this moment to deepen the appreciation of the Indigenous communities wherever we are, and to remind ourselves of our shared debt to Canada's First Peoples. Now, I'm Melanie Carter, and I'm a Regional Director of the Small Business Team here at EDC, and I am very pleased to be your host for today's episode. Now, to kick off the second season of our Export Impact Podcast, I am thrilled to introduce you to our new host, Bruce Croxon. Bruce is a well-known Canadian entrepreneur, television personality, and venture capitalist. He's currently a partner at the investment firm Round 13 Capital and co-host of The Disruptors, a weekly TV show on BNN Bloomberg that covers international business news, and it provides expert advice for Canadian companies. Bruce also co-founded the dating website Lavalife and was a member of the cast of CBC's Dragon's Den from 2011 to 2013. This season, Bruce will be sitting down once a month with Canadian entrepreneurs and industry experts to take a deep dive into what it takes for businesses to thrive internationally and grow on the global stage. He'll talk to seasoned entrepreneurs about the highs and the lows of exporting and how they overcome the challenges or key challenges when entering new markets. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Hey, great to be here, and thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you as our new host for Season 2. Now, to get us started, we would love to hear more about you, right, on your incredible journey as the creator of Lavalife and on how you became a venture capitalist with Round 13 Capital and a dragon on TV's popular Dragon's Den. But also, we're curious to know, a little bit more about yourself. I mean, we'd love for you to tell our listeners on what you enjoy doing in your free time when you're not busy with all of the various business ventures that you're part of. So take a moment to introduce yourself.
Sure. Listen, my name's Bruce Croxon, and this will resonate with a great deal of the audience, I'm sure. I'm a father of two kids, 21 and 19. So when you talk about time and focus and attention and what occupies your mind, kids are usually the first thing that pop to my mind, even though my kids are off and running. I'm a lifelong entrepreneur, first of all. I've always sort of done my own thing and tried to carve my own path. So very, very familiar with 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And, it's not a path or a road for everybody, most certainly, but it's definitely one that I took. And I was inspired to do so by watching my father do it as an immigrant to this country with $40 and a grade 8 education, and what the benefits of hard work and surrounding yourself with the right kind of people and doing the right thing could result in. And my journey's been one of many small businesses becoming medium-sized businesses and selling them and getting back and doing it again, both as an investor and an operator. You did mention Lavalife. That was one of my first and most notable successes. I co-founded what was arguably the first online dating site in the world. Mm-hmm. Very, very common today as a way for people to meet each other, but we were breaking new ground back in the late 80s, mid 90s, as the internet was just starting to become popular. And we were amongst the first. And that brand became big enough and the success of it became noted enough, I guess, that, as you mentioned, CBC got wind of it and wanted to know who the entrepreneurs were behind this software business, online business. And they came calling, and I did agree to do 3 years with them, which was a fantastic experience, and also provided me the opportunity to launch Round 13 Capital, which basically used the television platform and entrepreneurship and seeing a lot of different businesses, as that show did, to let entrepreneurs in Canada know that I was moving into a new stage in my career, which was moving from operator to investor. And if they were looking to be funded as a Canadian domiciled business with global aspirations, that Round 13 would be a good place to come. And I would be a good person to partner with, not only with a check, but hopefully with some expertise and some advice to help small businesses, as I said, become medium-sized businesses and hopefully, like Lavalife did, sell to an interested party one day. When I'm not working as an investor these days or hosting an EDC podcast, I've stayed pretty active and I'm an outdoors type of person. I like to ski and tennis and surfing, and I do like to travel to spots that have good waves and good snow and that kind of thing. So I try and travel pretty light, but still pretty much focused on the investments that Round 13 has made and making sure that we're continuing to grow and advise the entrepreneurs that we've cut checks into. And until those companies are sold, I'll be close by and at the helm.
That's wonderful. They're lucky to have you for sure. Great experiences to share. And through this episode, we're going to learn a little bit from that experience. So, as we know, exporting is a key theme of the Export Impact podcast. So, please tell us a little bit about your own experiences of doing business internationally.
Sure. I think my first experience in doing business internationally was probably Lavalife. And, most of my investments have actually been software oriented companies. So, the export portion of software versus some sort of hard goods is arguably very, very different. So actually one of the reasons I was motivated to join the EDC and in interviewing entrepreneurs was actually to learn a little bit myself as well, about what the journey is and maybe give some practical advice on how things are done in the material world as well. From Lavalife's perspective, listen, our first cities were Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. We had a basic service that was putting people together for love, dating, romance. And we didn't really think there was any reason that just because there was a border existing between Canada and the United States, that this wouldn't be applicable to the US and frankly, anywhere else in the world, but we weren't sure. So San Francisco was our first market. And my first advice to entrepreneurs looking to go outside of Canada is get over the sort of reluctance that the markets might be dramatically different, or there's a lot of nuances that you might not understand to the point that it would stop you from doing it. We took a bold step and on a hunch that people wanted to get together wherever they might be in the world. And at that point, it was a very local business. We were putting people together in local markets. So we launched in San Francisco and we're very, very successful right out of the gate there. Picked up some tips on how to do business in a local market like San Francisco through trial and error. But the notion that if you had a product or a service that was successful in Canada, there was no reason why it couldn't be successful in the US. And actually, we ended up going to many cities in the US after that, and also jumped off to Australia. And in those three markets, Canada, the US, and Australia, were relatively similar in terms of demographic and people's needs. But again, there were nuances to each market that we had to become aware of along the way. And if I had probably some EDC advice earlier, it would have saved us some time.
No, that's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that with us. You mentioned San Francisco kind of being your first city outside of Canada. Did I get that correct?
Yes.
And then you expanded throughout the US. Did you find that it was very different from one region of the US to the next?
Yes. In our business, it had a heavy customer service and call center perspective. So what we found was that in our business, people like to deal with people that they felt were in their local community as you were interacting as, customer service or getting people up on the system. Definitely when it came to connecting with people, there was a very local bias. If you were looking for love in San Francisco, the odds of it being somebody in Toronto is possible. But, really there was much more desire to hook up with somebody that you could, get to within an hour or so. But even more importantly than that, just the sort of nuance on the advertising, how the customer service people dealt with people that were calling in, that they knew they were from the local area, seemed to make a big difference to their comfort and their familiarity with our product. And I think as we learned that and made sure we populated locally, I think it really benefited us.
No, that's very cool. So clearly lots of success in your career with Lavalife and then with Round 13 Capital. My next question is kind of twofold and it bounces off what you just said now. So One, what strategies would you use to expand internationally? And then how do you identify those right markets to enter?
Well, listen, I mean, first of all, I think it's highly situational depending on the product or service that you have. And the first thing I would be looking at are the human needs or the needs for the product the same by region, right? And while you're at it, you might as well have a look around to see if those needs are being met through a local competitor that, you might not have had in your home market. So it really is about, I think, doing a market study. One of the few things I picked up through university, I wasn't a great student, but I remember this guy named Maslow, right? He had the whole hierarchy of needs thing. And, one thing I've come to realize is that the lower down Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and again, it starts with food, shelter, companionship, luckily for Lavalife was next up. The bigger the problem that you're solving, whatever community or region it is, the less you're going to have to spend on marketing to let people know about it, and the easier it's going to be to build a business. It really makes a big difference if you're solving a real problem. And those problems can vary from region to region, and they can be translated differently from region to region. So I think understanding the region that you're going into, seeing that the problem you're solving in Canada may or may not be the same kind of problem, and who else might be doing it, relative to the market that you've already been successful in, I think would be all relevant questions to ask.
So you identify those markets then by doing research, and then you realize that they may or may not be the right markets for you, or maybe the right market for you at a certain time.
Yeah, or it's going to yield a rank order priority as to, where the biggest needs and the biggest opportunities are based on competition, access to the market, how the problem is being solved in other ways in some markets versus yours. There's definitely nuance to market, and there's definitely different regulations by country, by state that may or may impact your business. And, listen, very timely that we're talking about export now, and interesting, with the time that we're facing with our largest trading partner to the south, because there's a lot of questions and answers that seem to be changing by the day. So staying on top of that and understanding what the latest playing field is, I think is going to be very, very important over the next 4 years, certainly. And who knows, if the policies they're laying down are here to stay, then this could be something that we're going to be faced with in terms of the challenge of exporting for quite some time.
Just goes to show how one of the benefits of exporting just might be, right? The more diversified you are, the less exposed you might be to what's going on in one region versus another, right? That kind of speaks to that.
Certainly agree with that.
Mm. So you're talking about, doing research and market plans and so on, and identifying the right countries. In my years at EDC, like I've heard multiple, especially small businesses, I'd say, be more opportunistic, right? They get an opportunity somewhere in some markets, maybe that they hadn't researched too much. And the question is, do they jump? Do they go? Do they not? What do they do, right? It's not always so planned out.
Yeah. So listen, I mean, I think one of the characteristics that make people entrepreneurs in the first place is that they see opportunity around every corner. And, one of the most common mistakes I see is, that great asset that entrepreneurs have can also be their biggest headwind, because there's only so many things you can do at the same time well. And, at the same time, if you're a small business and trying to meet payroll 2 weeks Friday, you can't really afford to turn down too many opportunities. So as something falls in your lap, it's very tempting, except when you get to the point where you realize that it's distracted from what should have been your top 3 priorities or markets or what have you, based on all the good things that we've done to learn why that is the case. So yeah, it's a very fine line. You don't want to kill the entrepreneurial spirit, but you do want to augment that instinct, I think, and intuition with good research and discipline. And then, sort of train the ability in the entrepreneur as to when to say no to something, which sometimes is the absolute hardest thing to do.
That kind of leads me to the next questions about mistakes, right? You've, during
Made
the
a
time.
few.
Well, no, maybe you
I
tell
can tell
me.
you, I've made a ton. I've made a ton.
You can
I
tell
call
us.
it my 51-49 rule is entrepreneurship. 51% of the time you're moving the ball ahead, for the inevitable 49% of the time you're taking it in the teeth. It's just the way it is, But that's 2% to the good. So, if you can keep doing that, you're good.
And you know what? Everyone benefits from learning from, others' mistakes. And so I'm sure that you'll have an opportunity to share some of those during the various episodes that you'll have with other entrepreneurs that you'll be discussing with. So you would have, some mistakes to share, but also on your time, during your time with Dragon's Den, you've heard many pitches from entrepreneurs looking to scale their business, right? You spoke about the one mistake of jumping too quick and has not reflected enough on the opportunity before jumping. What are the most common mistakes that those entrepreneurs that were pitching were doing when they were planning for global expansion? And what advice would you give them on those mistakes?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest, whether you're planning for global expansion or just trying to grow a business, I think the biggest mistake people make is, especially when you look at Dragon's Den, it was really, 40 minutes of pitch that people had. They spent the first 30 trying to convince you there was a human need for the product. And if they got you there, then, the last 10 was, well, this is the product that's going to solve that human need that we didn't think existed in the first place. So I come back to, listen, solving a real problem and a human need is sort of square one. And then I think when you get going, understanding what the priorities of an organization are, as we spoke about earlier, and sticking to that plan. One of my old business partners had a saying that said, focus is choice, right? You can choose to focus. And if you don't, then it becomes very difficult for not only you to move things ahead, but your team and the people around you. And then I think the third thing, again, back to where you spend your precious time, because time is that really precious commodity for small businesses in terms of where they prioritize. And I think you need to put an extraordinary amount of time into making sure that you choose the right people and partners to work with. So many times you're either working with friends that it wouldn't normally be the best person for the job, or you haven't given enough thought to the core values of the people that you want to be around. Because, at the beginning of a venture, or even when things are going great, everyone's on their best behavior and, everyone is a pleasure to work with. But inevitably in a small business, you're going to run into hiccups, and it's called a cycle for a reason. Sometimes things are good, but often things are a struggle. And it's how you act during those periods of struggle. And it goes to the kind of people that you've hopefully thoughtfully thought about partnering with, and who you turn to it for advice that you can count on to sort of get you through those struggling times.
That's really great advice. Inevitably, you're going to make mistakes. Some of them can be avoided if you speak with the right people and ensuring that your circle are with the right humans that can accompany you through that.
And that's often not only core values based, but it's often experience based, right? So, as I think about what I've learned about the EDC and, the amount of time that the organization has actually invested and put into understanding markets outside of our own, clearly there's no agenda outside of helping people get globally expanded for the good of the country, right? There's no room for dual agendas in a mandate like that. So things like trust and transparency and aligning yourself with people that are doing the right thing for the right reason, I think are worth thinking about in advance before you get too committed to a path or people that are not going to have your best interests at heart.
So switching gears a little bit. So we've talked about, the great benefits of exporting, and to name a few, there would be like, increased sales and increased opportunities. And companies that export tend to invest more in R&D and are more innovative. They generate more revenue generally. But there are also risks and challenges, right, to consider when you're exporting. As a venture capitalist, how do you support Canadian companies looking to expand globally? And what advice would you give them to ensure that they're prepared for those challenges that come with going global?
Well, I think you have to understand, again, the nuance of every market, right? So every market would bring with it a set of risks that, you might not necessarily have at home. Like if you think about Canada, Canada is a big country, but it's really not, and one of the reasons is, for an example, why as a venture capitalist, not only, but 95% of the time we prioritize backing Canadian domiciled companies is because there's not too many people that we can't get to understand who it is that we're backing, what they've done before, who they're friends with, what they, as you asked, what do you like to do in your spare time? I mean, we can get at all that information because it's, at the end of the day, a relatively small community stretched out over a large geography. You're going into the United States, it's 10 times the size, using the US as an example, with relationships and ways of doing things and connections and methodologies that can be quite different than, our cozy little ecosystem here in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, right? The Holy Trinity. I think that, you just need to put in the time to understand that.
Very well. You talked about connections, and we all know, or you would know, building connections overseas is crucial when entering a new market. You've alluded to it already during the conversation. Based on your experience, what are the most effective strategies for connecting with potential buyers or distributors? What advice would you give our listeners?
Well, yeah, I think it's as old a method as it's been around a long time. Gathering people together. We had a hiccup on this during COVID where the sort of getting together in person was difficult. And some would argue that you can be as effective over Zoom. But, the trade shows and associations and getting together where people are all there for the same reason, which is to compare products and services and explore markets and develop partnerships and relationships around whatever product or service that you're vested in. I think it's very, very difficult to replace that. And I also think it's very difficult to replace, what you get from a face-to-face meeting as well, depending on the size of the opportunity. And then after that, I think it's basically CRM management and making sure that you stay in touch with people and continually refine your product or service to make sure that you're addressing a real need. And then knowing as well when the efforts are not bearing fruit, because what I've just outlined not only can be a great deal of expense in terms of time spent, but it can also be a great deal of expense in terms of travel and being away from home and away from your organization that you hope will continue to do what you need it to do in your absence. And depending on the size of that company, that can be either a massive leap of faith or, listen, we've got the structure in place. I'm okay to be away for X amount of time. You know what I mean? So it really is situational, but definitely would be taking all of those things into account as I look to expand beyond my border.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. I'm hearing the human piece. Of course, the human part is important. Well, you talked about the CRM, right? The operations need to be stable and solid, which would give you the data to identify whether or not you were successful in whatever endeavor you took on, if it was worth the investments or not, right? I mean, that whole operation piece and collecting of data is also so crucial.
Important. Yep.
Let's look ahead a little bit and talk about trends or opportunities that exist for Canadian businesses in the global marketplace. My question is two-part for you. What are those trends that you are currently seeing? And how can companies position themselves to take advantage of these opportunities and expand in new markets, for example, in the growing Indo-Pacific region?
Well, it's funny. I don't have a lot of investments in the Indo-Pacific region currently, but you look at markets that are fast growing and have come from here and are now on a rapid pace to there. I mean, obviously, if you can identify those markets that are catching up, if you will, or that are an active hotbed of activity, obviously, if you can become part of that and your product or service fills a need that is required, though, that's definitely where some time and attention should be spent. In terms of global trends, again, 90% of what I do and look at are software. So artificial intelligence is obviously front and center in terms of what venture capitalists are investing in these days. But it's also a lesson. We experienced it this week, and I don't know when this will air exactly, but it was this week, sort of the last week in January, where the Chinese came out with an AI innovation that completely upended the valuations of what artificial intelligence had done domestically and in the US in terms of progress and valuation. So I think that's a really good illustration on just how quickly things can change. And I think that's a big thing that's changed over 20 years You used to be able to get a foothold in a product or service, and the pace of innovation was such that you had some time to develop a market. You had some barriers to entry, particularly in technology, but I'd say that would apply to other industries as well. And I think one of the things that we need to realize is that supply chains and logistics and technology has helped all of this move a lot faster. So when you get a sniff of something working or a market that you're moving into that you get some early signs of success, I think it's imperative that you need the organization to be ready to move very, very fast, because there's no secrets anymore and information travels very quickly. So you need to be able to really be in a position to be agile and take advantage of opportunities as they arise. And, that goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. Sometimes that's difficult to do if you've got too many balls in the air at any given time, right? If you've got 5 markets you're trying and 3 of them hit, you might be able to handle that. If all 5 do, you've got some decisions to make, for example.
No, that's fair. And funny that we talk about Indo-Pacific. That's an emerging market that there's a lot of focus around it right now. And you're saying you don't have a lot of investments there right now, but you did mention in the beginning that after the US with Lavalife, you actually were in Australia.
We did.
Correct?
Australia, we did. And the reason we went to Australia was our research and our intuition largely told us that Canadians and Australians have a lot in common, right? I mean, I knew that from traveling the world myself, but we just had a hunch that the markets were similar enough, English speaking, ex-colonialists, right? That, we thought we would be successful there. One of the challenges we ran into early, and it's one that you need to consider, is the time zone difference, right? When you're trying to do business across the world while trying to run a company back home, there's only so many hours in a day. And the fatigue and the trying to manage a company with midnight calls while you're also have a day job, again, goes to the size of the organization, the capacity to take on something and then actually execute well enough to get it done. Those are definitely factors that you need to take into account. But yes, we did very well in Australia. It's just been many years since I've had a product that I've launched or relaunched down there.
Fascinating. So to your point, this is up and coming in the sense that there's a lot of focus there, a lot of attention. There's a lot of support for companies to go into that region right now. And you've seen how you can actually be successful. But there are definitely, like in every market, considerations like time zones that you need to think about to prepare yourself to go into these markets.
Time zones, and one thing we haven't talked about is the legal infrastructure in different countries. If things go wrong, what court of law, and unfortunately it happens, right? Where you have a dispute or you don't get paid, right? Or you're arguing about something that you thought you'd agreed on. Every country has different systems and legals and laws, and some are just impossible if you're an outsider to cut through, right? There's heavy bias in some markets. Canada's, pretty, I would say, relatively fair in how we treat people and how we treat everyone. It's not always the case, right? So understanding how different markets react to disputes, how you get paid if you've provided a product or a service and there's trouble with the money coming your way, what do you do? Every market's different.
Yeah, totally. Goes to show like there's so much to learn. So equip yourself with the right people around you. Seek advice, ensure that you have the right advisors to support you in your endeavors, right?
Exactly. I mean, sometimes selling the product or service is the easiest thing. Getting paid for it might be the toughest, right? And if you don't get paid, you're not going to be successful.
You're not going to be in business for long, that's for sure. So many great things were shared already. And like I said, I know that a lot of these little stories and experiences will be shared throughout the various episodes. But before we wrap up today, Bruce, please tell us what excites you about season 2 of the Export Impact podcast. And are there any particular topics or themes that you're eager to explore with entrepreneurs in the upcoming episodes?
Well, yeah, listen, I mean, again, being a lifetime entrepreneur, I have tremendous, tremendous respect for anybody that has decided to take a shot off the sweat of their own labor without reporting into anybody to try and generate enough interest in a product or service to cover your rent, hire some people, put food on the table, take care of your family. I know how hard that is. I know getting from 0 to 5, even 5 million or 10 million in sales, which is still considered a very small business. It's a very, very tough thing to do. So the people that we're going to be talking to this year, by and large, are out doing it. They've had some modicum of success. They are looking for and are open to ways to continue to grow and be successful. I'm a curious guy by nature, and I love asking questions and I love learning about people's endeavors. And I find actually in the entrepreneurial community that those qualities are often shared. And I think we're going to have an exciting season of give and take and questions and discussions and maybe the odd disagreement that I think the audience will benefit from and will get a chance to share some insights with.
Bruce, thank you so much for your time and for your generosity in sharing your insights and great experiences with us today. It was truly a privilege to have this discussion with you. And I will be listening, and I look forward to tuning in to season 2 of the podcast. And to our audience, thanks for joining us today on the Export Impact Podcast. If you'd enjoyed today's episode, we'd love you to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on your favorite streaming platform. And on that, until next time.